All right, I'm James Crawford, and this is my presentation on external data and importing in the United States. So I'd like to start with the obvious. If you ever zoom out on the OpenStreetMap of the United States in the last year or so, you may have noticed that the state of Florida has progressively been getting a little greener in the peninsula, and that's been the result of the Florida land use import, which I've been conducting solo for most of it, but now I've got someone working with me. I'll talk about that. But this is just one of several imports that I've started to manage after another user who edits OpenStreetMap was abandoning these projects. They would upload and then they would not go through the complete process. And so I would come in and I would take over and I would make sure that they would get done and get done right. So the Florida, I've come up with a process to do the Florida data. I'd like to cover on that. It's there's three main things, but conflation takes up most of my time, just figuring out how to work the data in with what's already on OpenStreetMap. And then I use the two tools, QGIS and JASM, to run my whole process of getting that conflation done and getting the data on OpenStreetMap. So with conflation, I normally start by downloading all the land use and natural objects that are in the county that I'm working on. I work on county by county, and I'll load all natural and all land use objects. And then I'll go through each object and I'll determine what objects I can delete and what objects may be modified to help me. And so here's three examples I've got. On the left, I've got a wetland, and this wetland on OpenStreetMap has no tags. It's just drawn as a wetland. And an object like this, it's got okay geometry, but it's not very specific. You can see like on the top that it's kind of overlapping on that farm. And an object like this, I would choose to delete, since deleting it doesn't really provide any metadata loss. And I could add my own data on top of it that could be of equal or higher quality. And then the objects like this second object, which is a large lake that has very detailed geometry and a name, and also some other tags from the NHD, National Hydrology Data Set. And an object like this, I can't really delete because there's no real process that I have for transferring names or any object like that onto the import, but I do have tools for dealing with the objects that I don't delete. And then there's other cases with businesses, such as this gas station, which is tagged on a land use object. It's with businesses on OpenStreetMap, you could tag them either like on a building or on a node. And it's also technically not wrong to put them on land use, but I transfer them to a node, which is more easy to process by engines that are trying to query those types of objects. And it makes it easier for me because then I can delete the land use object and replace it with the import data without losing too much quality. And so the next thing I do once I've done all that sort of processing, which takes a lot of time, is I load it into QGIS, and I use the tools available in QGIS, such as buffer and difference, and as well as flip and lines to polygons. And these are all really useful geometry tools that you can use to process data that you have. So I'll load in my file, and then I'll create a buffer around like the land use data I've loaded, for example. And then I will use the difference tool to subtract that from what the land use file that was provided to me by the external data. And I will then have data that would be already conflated to OpenStreetMap without having to do any sort of manual review of saying, I need to unglue these and pull these out so that I can separate this land use object that is already on OpenStreetMap. And yeah, I do this also for roads. If there's a road, I use the buffer tool to buffer the road. And so I can create automatically a boundary around the road so that the land use object doesn't fall on the road or any overlap like that. And that generally makes it cleaner in areas like cities where lots of roads can cause a problem if land use are starting to overlap on the boundary of the road, and then it becomes really messy for other editors to edit that area. And then once I've done all my QGIS work, I save it into my computer and then I open it in JASM. And JASM has these two very powerful tools. There's the validator, which you can run, and it will find all sorts of errors with your data file. And so you run the validator and I'll find these like random geometry errors that came out of QGIS. And so I'll just go through the validator and I'll fix every single issue. There's generally only like 100 or so. It's not too big of a deal. And once all that's done, I use the search tool to find some more like specific cases to how I do my process, such as with cemeteries. Since most cemeteries that are already on OpenStreetMap already have names, I don't delete those. And so therefore I have to purge those from my land use file. But sometimes that leads to cases where the existing cemetery boundary doesn't fully overlap what was in the land use import. And so I have to go in and find all the cemeteries that are in the land use import. And then I have to make sure that it's not some weird clipping issue regarding the data that was already on the OpenStreetMap, and then I'll have to delete it or save it depending on what I see. And I described the whole full process in detail. There's a lot more than just these two things that I do, and it's all on the wiki page. The floating land use import is the only import I'm working on. The other import that I've mainly worked on is the HIFLD, but so far I've only really gotten documentation done for this import. It's a very extensive data set of all sorts of government facilities and government interests like trails or libraries, just things like that. And I made a whole wiki page with separate sections for each one, and I plan to write instructions for each individual data set and getting those done. It's a separate process since they all have sometimes different storage schemes, and also they need completely different tagging depending on what it is when you add the OpenStreetMap. And then I'd also like to mention these other 3 data sets that I've seen and also worked on in the past. There's the National Address Database, which is something a lot of you may have heard of. It's a recent project by the Department of Transportation, National Department of Transportation, to save all addresses in a unified format so that anyone can access it, since that's not been a thing that's existed in the past and is very useful. And then it's not full coverage nationwide, but it has a lot of coverage over many states, and it's available in the public domain. So on OpenStreetMap, we're allowed to use it through our editors such as Rapid and Map with AI. And then PASDA is a regional agency in Pennsylvania that has all sorts of data from, I've seen raster land use. I haven't really dug into it much, but I think they also have like address data and business programs as well. And then there's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, I think, and that's hosted on this website. And it has data about protected areas in the coastline of the United States, as well as things like oil operations. I've already conducted an import in the past of offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, operational ones, of course. And that's where it comes from. And it's very useful resource as well, and also needs to be looked at. And the point I want to say is I'm just one person, and the HIFLD alone has over 100,000, 200,000 more objects that need work. And a lot of it is kind of a manual review thing, but it is really, really useful data. And, there's people that I've worked on in the past, such as William, who's in this room. And I'm really thankful for the help that I've received, and any help that'll come in the future, as well as the National Address Database, which has been a sort of a nationwide effort as well. And so one thing I did want to cover were the import guidelines, which I'm sure if you've ever tried to dabble in importing and you've seen before, they're very, it's very useful to have this, since it does provide guidance to all our importers, and it's very specific. But there are a couple problems that I did want to mention with it, and I'll go through those now. So first, I want to discuss that there's this this sort of thing that's sort of taking off now is using change set tags instead of tags on an object. So we're moving away from tagging like source equals the data set that you got it from on every object that you add to OpenStreetMap, and we're moving more towards adding the source tag of the data set to your change set, which makes it easier if you're just trying to find the history of the object. You can just go to the first edition and then just click on the user, and then you can see exactly where it came from. But there's really no consensus for this yet on the import guidelines. There's no guidance on like what tags to use or how to use them. And so this is a screenshot from the imports mailing list, where this user, username Mark, has this guide he's providing to another prospective importer, where he's saying you should use these tags such as import, yes, website, and the wiki page, and source URL. But there's no documentation to back him up on this. He's just telling them to do this without any real guidance on what he should be doing. And this is only, for example, not really what he should be doing. And so I think that's something we do need to address in the near future. And then there's another problem I've noticed, and this is a problem you may have seen if you look on the OpenStreetMap with them very frequently, is that there's not a lot of very concrete language. Sometimes it's very useful to have a sort of, ambiguous meaning if you're trying to like widen the definition of an object, but sometimes you really do need like an absolute definition with something like the import guidelines, especially where you want it to be very clear, very concise guidance. And so this is the first sentence on the import guidelines, where it uses the word shall, which is very defining, very yes. And then there's another sentence, which is a little bit down on the page about writing a wiki page for your import. And it just uses please. And he's like, please do it. But it is a required step to have a wiki page for your import. And so if we want to move forward, we need to fix these kind of issues as well. And there's another issue I wanted to bring up is that if you've ever noticed, the mailing lists are kind of an old technology. And now this very new thing that has come around is the OpenStreetMap Community Forum. And this OpenStreetMap Community Forum is very useful. It's based on discourse, and I've had a lot of success with it, seeing what other people have discussed. And it's a lot more accessible than the mailing list, especially for newer users who aren't familiar with that sort of technology. And it's a lot easier to track like the discussion of an import because it's all in a thread, and doesn't get confused with response threads written out on the email or not written out on the email. And so I definitely think this is also something that needs to be considered going forward. And so here's a screenshot from 2 wiki pages this is on the left is the Florida Land Use Import, on the right is the HIFLD. And the point I wanted to make with this page is that it's very important to keep your documentation up to date when you're editing an import. I've had a lot of things that I've discovered that I do differently now, and things that I've changed in my process. And I make sure that I go back in and I change the instructions to reflect that, or update something that's changed over time. And I think it's very important that and it's very useful for me to keep in touch with people, so I can show them what I'm doing right now, and they can always see in the history of what has been in the past. And it's always good to keep your documentation up to date and accurate. So I wanted to mention some people I've worked with, of course, William, and then on the HIFLD and the hospitals. And then there's many editors who have worked on this particular data set, the HIFLD electric power transmission lines, as well as the National Address Database. These power transmission lines, it's a full data set of all actually important transmission lines in the United States. And it's very useful as a reference. It's like a backlit drop for adding data. And many people have worked with that, I've seen. And then there's my really good friend, Lost, who I've personally trained with the Florida Land Use Import. And spending 6 hours on call with someone explaining your exact process in fully detailed really does make it really clear what things you've missed in your instructions. And so teaching him, I have added like 4 or 5 steps to my instructions as well. And that's all I've got.